Okay, you can start.
Good morning again to the Indian viewers and good evening to my US viewers. Welcome to the webinar on Entrepreneurship Talk. I am Dr. Udit Chawla, Project Manager, IISER Bhopal. Just to give you a little brief introduction about IISE. IISE is Innovation and Incubation Centre for Entrepreneurship, located at IISER Bhopal, which is an institute of national importance. It provides space, awareness, networking, and mentorship for the success of startups and promotion of entrepreneurship culture. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Amjad Hussain, CEO IISE, to further brief us about the speaker.
Thanks, Sudeep. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thanks, Sudeep. On behalf of Innovation and Incubation Centre for Entrepreneurship at IISER Bhopal, I welcome today's speaker, Dr. Colleen Janzak, who is a Chief Operating Officer at Scintillation Nanotechnologies in United States. Before we get started, let me take this opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Colleen. Dr. Colleen, as I mentioned, is a Chief Operating Officer at Scintillation Technologies. She did her education from various places, got her Bachelor's of Arts degree from the College of Worcester in Ohio, and also did her PhD in analytical chemistry from University of Arizona. After graduating from University of Arizona, she moved to a prestigious industry, which is Roche, and worked at the tissue division section in Roche from 2011 to 2014, where she worked as a scientist. And then she moved back to University of Arizona as a research scientist from 2014 to 2019, where she spent a little bit more than 5 years as a research scientist. Then in January 2020, she co-founded Scintillation Nanotechnologies with other co-founders. The company is still in the initiation phase. They still are operating in a lean form, have a small setup, and also a couple of very closely bonded people who are working in the industry, and they are also in the process of raising their first round of venture funding. They are supported by various grants, including SBIR in the United States. And today she will be sharing her experience on operation part and having day-to-day challenges in starting up a company and also running it with the lean budget. So I would welcome Dr. Colleen Janzak to deliver today's lecture. Welcome, Colleen. Please start your presentation. Thank you. You're mute. You're mute. You're mute, Dr. Colleen.
What a classic Zoom error. Thank you very much, everybody, well, thank you, Deep, for inviting me to do this. This is exciting, and thinking about starting a company is a very challenging and exciting thing to do. So I'm glad to share my experience with you. And I know it's a small sliver, but if it helps, I'm more than glad to do it. So I will be happy to talk to anybody about your own experiences, and maybe we can compare notes after this is over. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, I think. Okay. There we go. Is my screen visible?
Yep.
Okay. So what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about startup operations. And what I really would like to let you know is that it's more than managing day-to-day activities. But to start with, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born in a city in Ohio, but I was raised in rural Ohio. So this is actually the farm I grew up on. This is the land, and it snows there. So, it's very pretty in the fall and very cold in the winter, but very green other times of the year. So I grew up in rural Ohio and went to school also in rural Ohio. But then I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. So I went to graduate school for analytical chemistry, graduated, and then went into industry for a little while. So that's me and my mom there. That was a long time ago. Feels like a long time ago. And after a few years in industry, I came back to the university because the problems of the research in academia were just so interesting to me. I just couldn't stay away. After a couple of years, my advisor and I had an idea, and we decided we would start a company. So here's our building. And I wish I could say that this whole building was full of my company, but it's not. We inhabit, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but we inhabit a little space back up here behind these leaves right there. So we have a little space up there, and that's where we do all of our R&D and our manufacturing, right up in there. And we've been a company on papers actually since 2018. But those first couple of years, you get excited. You start a company. Yeah, let's start a company, and then what? So it's kind of stepping off the edge a little bit. I've been in academia for so long, I didn't quite know what to do next. So those first 2 years were we didn't really have any money for operations. We didn't have any money to proceed. We didn't really quite know how to proceed. Thankfully, the university had a lot of resources that we could tap into to get us started. So some of them were customer discovery programs, which was something I'd never tried before and didn't think I would like, but it was extremely useful, and I'm glad we did it. Our tech program there is much better than at other institutions, and so they were actually able to give us a little bit of funding to do some preliminary studies, which was also extremely helpful, because when you're working in an academic lab, you can't just take funding, right, to do something that's for a company that doesn't work. So this let us kind of branch out and find out whether or not acting as a company would be something feasible. So the tasks of a startup, you have an idea, right? And then, so for some reason you decide to yourself, I'm going to make a startup, maybe you and your co-founders. And it seems really straightforward. You have this great idea and you're going to proceed with it. So the idea is you'll buy some stuff and you'll put something together, whatever it is that your idea is, and then you'll sell it, right? Seems really straightforward. You go right from purchasing your materials to manufacturing your product to selling it and earning money. It's going to be awesome. And then you start thinking about some of the other tasks that you might need to do in order to accomplish those goals. Okay, so you start making a list. You'll need some people, so you'll need some personnel. In order to accomplish this task, you'll need some materials and equipment. You need a place to do it, so you need a location. You need to ship your materials somewhere. You better make sure whatever it is that you're making works before you send it to your customer. So you need some quality control too. And if something happens and one of your customers comes back and says, hey, this didn't work the way you told me it would, you need some information behind it to find out what happened and where it happened and what went wrong. You need to know if your product is protected by patents or pending patents. Do you have a license? Can you sell your product? So you have to get your licenses in order. And then do you have the funds? If you're operating very, very lean, you don't need maybe a whole lot of funds, but you still need something. Does that come from your pocket? Does that come from your co-founder's pocket? Are you going to work on this together? Are you going to find an investor? So there are a lot of tasks quite suddenly springing up on your list, but it seems manageable. And then you start thinking of some more, and then suddenly there are more tasks on your list, right? Customer service, somebody calls you, hey, Colleen, this didn't work. You told me this would work this way and it didn't work. They're going to call you directly. It's a startup. It's only a few people. So you are the customer service. So put that on your list. IP strategy. If your product is something very IP heavy, how are you going to protect that IP? Patents are so very expensive. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Safety should always be first, right? And then you need an operations strategy and a value proposition. What are you actually offering your customers? And then there has to be development, and then there's an exit plan, and then there's regulation compliance, and then there's packing and shipping, and there's a business plan, and there's a sales strategy, and then you have to know your market really well so you know where you fit into your market. Okay, so the list is getting longer and longer. It's looking a little rough, but it's still manageable, right? You can still do this. And then you make the list longer. because you're thinking about all the things you'll need to accomplish in order to accomplish the tasks that were already on your list, and suddenly there are more tasks. They just keep multiplying. What will happen when you need to grow? How do you communicate your ideas to your customers, to your investors, to your fellows, to your collaborators? What about investment? What happens to your waste? When you make trash, where does it go and how do you take care of it? It doesn't seem like a big thing, right? You throw it in the trash can, but actually, depending on the kind of trash you make, you have to keep careful track of what happens and where that goes and how much it costs to take care of your waste. There's depreciation. What is depreciation and what does that mean to your models? Do you have a legal structure? Do you have someone who can help you with your legal structure? Do you have security? What about your competition? Are you the only person in your market, or are there others waiting there too who might have products that are as good as yours, better than yours? Is yours cheaper? What is your edge? Do you have inventory? And where do you keep your inventory? Do you need to travel to reach your customers? So now the tasks that was just, buy, make, sell, your tasks have suddenly become numerous and overwhelming. And then you add some more, and pretty soon you're like this guy here, your head down in the water with your feet sticking out. So many tasks, and you don't know which end is up. And so you realize you need some help. So you go find some help, right? Uh-oh, where's my next slide? There it is. So you find some help. You maybe enlist the help part-time, full-time, paid, unpaid, depending on how you can handle it. For example, a CEO who can help you plan, a CTO who can help you gather all the things about your technology. So that would be your development and some of your production issues and how to scale up in production and some of these other things. You have manufacturing. So that's, how you get your materials in. That's the part we started out with, buy the materials, make the stuff and send it out the door. You have your chief marketing officer who can help you with sales and marketing and how you're going to interact with your customers, because that is absolutely critical, especially for a startup. That relationship with your customers is so very important. And maybe you have a CBO, and some of these jobs, maybe they overlap a little bit here and there, and you work together and it works with, and you put those tasks into these different, colored circles here, and everybody does their thing and does their group of tasks and the work gets done. That would be nice when you're sorting these tasks into a functional structure. In a startup, it's, at least in my experience, it's very, very different. And the tasks in a startup is more, each task for each person is much, much larger. So I made my circles larger and they overlap. And there are places where maybe you're working alone and places where maybe you're working together. And sometimes you're all working on the same thing. And sometimes you're not just working on things that you thought were going to be operations. You're also working on CEO kinds of stuff, or CBO, or marketing, or you're doing sales yourself. We've made some sales, and the first couple of sales has been me and our technician. It has not been a designated sales staff. It's been us. But primarily that's because we just don't have that many people. But that's also part of covering those initial customers. We know our products best. So when we're getting those first customers on board, we needed somebody who really, really knew the products. And that's me and the technician, right? So these jobs are huge, much bigger circles than they were on the previous slide. And they overlap. And sometimes you don't have all these people. Maybe you only have 3 or 2, or maybe you have a couple more and you can spread the work out a little bit. So an important thing to remember is that established businesses have their structures set already. In a startup, you're developing that structure and everything in it. So if you think about operations for a large company, they already know what they're doing. They know what their tasks are. They know what falls into operations and what materials they need to buy and what they need to do to get the product out of the door. In a startup, you're deciding that, you're determining that, and sometimes you're finding that by trial and error. Sometimes by a lot of trial and error and a lot of error. So it's you have to be patient and just keep pressing forward on it. But the other people in your group, because these circles overlap so tightly, they have to be people that you can work with very closely, because a lot of times you're working together on projects that overlap very closely. You're doing the same things. You're working toward the same goal. You can't just, take a piece of the work and run away with it. You have to work together. Otherwise, you can't get all of those tasks done. And you have to prioritize. That's one thing that we've had to learn. With limited resources, limited people, limited time, limited money, you have to do some very serious prioritization in order to get your work done. But there's hope. So we're focusing on the operations part of the business. So that was the yellow circle here. And what is operations in a business? So I Googled it, just like anybody would, right? I Googled it. And I found some quotes here that seem to fit pretty nicely. Operations might be managing inner workings of the business. So the buying of the raw materials, the who does what and how does it get done and where does it go after that, and how you control all of the raw materials and the intermediate materials and the final product, and right until it leaves your shipping dock, if we had a shipping dock, right until it leaves the bench top in a tube of your business. Running the company and making money, that's another one. That's maybe oversimplified. It sounds very grandiose, really, running a company and making money. You're increasing the value of your enterprise to earn a profit. You're ensuring that production is completed from start to finish. That's an important one. And this is my favorite here, harvesting value from assets owned by a business. It makes it sound like value is just kind of laying there on the floor of the factory. And if you just go pluck it and put it in your basket, you can harvest all of that value. That sounds nice, but I don't know if that's really what happens. In my experience, operations in a startup is everything that takes action. All of that, anything that needs action falls into operations at least in our case, for a startup. So that includes buying anything. That means setting up the lab space, manufacturing space. That means hiring personnel. That means finding those personnel. That means managing those personnel. Deciding what products and how much you need, managing your inventory, even sending the product out. When we send product out to our customers, I pack it in a box and take it to our shipping agent, FedEx, or even USPS, and send it out that way. So anything that needs action, I consider that falls into my yellow circle of operations for our startup. So when I was getting things started and when we were trying to plan what exactly we needed, we asked ourselves the typical questions: who, what, when, where, and why. And so starting at the top, we decided, what do we make? Do you make a consumable product? Is it a one-time purchase for your customers? Is it a service? Or is it something, maybe a pay per use kind of thing that's kind of like a service, but maybe more like a subscription-based business? Do you maybe grow flowers and then sell flowers, or do you sell the plants? Which of those is your business model? Do you have software? Do you sell the software, or do you sell the use of the software, the license of the software? Is your business based on labor in some way? Or do you manufacture equipment? So what is your product? And what are you actually sending out the door to your customers? In our case, we're making a consumable. So these are our products here over on the right. So we're making a consumable product, but in your startup, it might be something, one of these other options. It could be many different things, but you need to know what you make so you know what your focus is. How do you make it? Do you need specialized equipment like a liquid handler? Maybe don't. Maybe you just need an empty room with, a couple of tools and you're good to go. But maybe you need something fancier like this over here on the left. Do you need materials? Do you need dangerous materials? How do you store those materials? So that's something to make a list of too. And do you need other equipment? What kind of functions are you going to be doing at the bare minimum? And I'm talking the bare minimum. What kind of functions do you have in your operations that you need to cover in order for your company to work? How do you make your product? And so you can sit down and list that out, and that will help you determine some things that you will need to consider later on down the road. Who will make it? So do you have the expertise to make it? So this guy, he does not have the expertise. He probably has the time looking at him, but he doesn't have the expertise, so he doesn't make it. I have the expertise, but I might not have the time. I'm too busy with all of those other, 900 other tasks on the picture with the guy upside down in the water. So probably not me either. Our technician, however, has both the expertise and the time. And so he is primarily one of the people who makes our products. And so you need to decide this. It seems like a really simple thing to think about. And when we were first getting started, we had a mentor who asked us, what are you going to do when somebody calls you and say they want your product? Do you need to make an arrangement with a contractor who will make this for you? And no, I'll go upstairs and I'll make some and I'll send it. That works for the first couple of customers, but at some point there are so many tasks that might not be feasible anymore. And when that comes, you'll need to have a plan in place about how you will deal with that, because you can't have your production screech to a halt because you don't have time to make your product because you're too busy running your business. And so this is an important question. It seems really, really simple, but it's a critical one. When will you make your product? And so does your customer call you and then you say, well, how much do you need? And then you pull it directly from inventory and ship it to them? Are there time factors that affect your production schedule? Do you have stock or do you build on demand? So do they call you instead? And then you go buy raw materials and then you manufacture and you go through quality control and then you ship it? Is that how that works? This is important to know as well. If your customer calls you and you tell them, I can have it to you in a week, is that week because it's coming directly from inventory, or is that week because you can manufacture it that quickly? Can you really manufacture it that quickly? Can you order your raw materials that quickly and be sure that they will be shipped to you? Or do you keep them on hand in a certain amount of raw material inventory so they're always there? Things to think about. When do you make it? And why do you make it? This is kind of two questions, right? Why do you make it? Maybe these are reasons that are related to why you started a company. You started a company because you believe in your product. You started a company because you want to make money. You started a company because this is how you can make an impact for the better in the world. You started a company because you just love business. It could be a lot of reasons, right? But what I'm talking about here is, why do you make it? What are the triggers for making it? And that means internal and external triggers, right? If your customer calls you and they're customarily used to receiving your product in a couple of days, and you look in your inventory and it's all gone, then maybe your inventory count needs to be your trigger so that you always have a minimum amount that you know you can ship out in a moment's notice if your product can handle that. Is a trigger your customer request? They call you up and say, I need this giant digging machine. I just need one, and it's however many millions of dollars, and then you get started on the order right away, and the people start building it in your factory. And so is that what triggers your production, or is it a timing thing? Does your material go bad over time? Do you need to make sure that you have fresh on hand at any time that your customer might call and request it? So what are the triggers that make you make more of your product? That's something else to keep in mind, because that will definitely affect how you establish your production plan. Even in a startup, even if it's just you making stuff, you'll need to know these things so that you can establish a plan and a pattern that you can rely on. And it might change over time, and that's okay. But in order to get started, asking yourself these questions can help you understand what you need to have on hand. And so you can, I forgot another critical one. Where will you make it? That's pretty important. So you need to consider the requirements of your location. A lot of people think, I'm starting a startup, I'll do it in my garage. But that can work for some things, right? If you're building a software app and you have your computers in your garage or something, then that could be fine. Or if you're building some device, maybe that's okay. But you have to keep in mind zoning requirements. At least in the US, you have zoning requirements. You can't go build a factory in a residential area or something like that. And resources that are available to you. So if your garage doesn't have running water, maybe that's a problem. If my garage didn't have a safety shower and a fume hood, that would be a pretty serious problem for me. So I can't do this in a garage. It's neither practical nor legal. So instead I have to do this in lab space. So the garage is out for me. And so we have to have lab space instead. And that is, I don't need a whole lot of lab space, but I do need lab space that has a fume hood and has a sink and has waste disposal system so that I can be sure that I know how to get rid of my waste, and has safety features and security like the doors lock and these kinds of things. So where will you make it? That is one of the final questions you should ask yourself maybe. And then you can start organizing your requirements and the assets that you have to fulfill those requirements. So you have, your product is a consumable product. In our case, that's true. We make a consumable product. So our assets there are our IP, our trade secrets, and our competitive edge. And so we can start to orient and make a plan about how we can use our IP, our trade secrets, and our competitive edge to continue making our consumable product and sell it. How we do it is by synthetic procedures. So the assets that we have there that fit into that are our raw materials, our lab, our equipment. Where is, of course, we need a bench, a fume hood, chemical storage. So we have a designated laboratory space. Who does it? The personnel with time and experience to do it. And that's right now is me and our technician, Ray. And when we do it, most of our products, thankfully, we can keep in stock. So we need storage space to keep those products and containers to keep them in. And they seem like minor things, but then if you make, some lot of your materials and you don't have a place to keep it until your customers want it, it seems like a small problem, but when you get there, it could be actually a pretty big problem if you have nowhere to store your materials until you sell them. So once you start building this, I think this is the way this worked in my mind. I don't know if it will work for you, but this is the way it worked in my mind. You can start filling in that huge, huge list of tasks, not just between people, but and how you're going to fit those tasks into your requirements and use your assets that you have, limited as they are in a startup, in order to accomplish your goals. And so as you proceed, you can start making a process map. And I found this really helpful for me because this was again in my ignorance of starting. I'll just go upstairs to the lab and I'll make some. It works the first 2 times, and then after that it doesn't work anymore. So you make up a process map to help you understand exactly what you need, who needs to do it, where does everything go, what are you making, where does that go. So for example, for a very basic product, you might have an initial synthesis and you have some input of material. So you have to buy these things, right? It takes some amount of time. You make some amount of waste, unfortunately, and that is a cost you have to deal with, but also a loss of money you have to deal with, right? You don't want to waste any more than you absolutely have to, because that's a very precious resource of your money going away from your business. And you end up with an output, an early product. Maybe it's a step 1 of whatever your product is going to be. And maybe do some intermediate measurements and analysis. So that's data. What are you going to do with those documents? That's another thing to keep in mind. How are you going to keep track of those measurements and analysis and keep track of all of your lots? So then it can go back into another intermediate process that maybe takes some more time with more resources to go back in again and more waste, unfortunately. And you get another product, another intermediate product. How do you separate this product from this product? You sure don't want those to get mixed. In the early stages, it seems like that should be pretty simple, right? You don't have so much product that you're losing track of it. But you can lose track of your products very, very quickly. So you'll need to have your lot numbers and how you're going to label everything well established so that you can understand it, and so your technician can understand it, and so anybody who comes to work with you or for you can understand it as well. You don't want to accidentally mix this this first early stage product with this early stage product and then end up with an end product that doesn't work for reasons that you don't understand, and it's because you somehow mixed the two or confused them. So then you can carry on and make your final product, and that takes more time. Maybe it makes a better product. There's more input, more waste, more measurements. So you need to keep these measurements separated from those measurements so you know at what point in your process those measurements were made and what they really mean. And then maybe there's some quality control. And finally, you have a finished product. So making this kind of map can help you understand what goes into making it, what kind of time does it take, what steps are there, where do you need to have separation in your process so you don't get mixed up and end up putting, precursor A with precursor C instead of precursor A with precursor B and causing a serious problem. It helps you understand what your turnover rate is, how fast can you make product in a practical sense, not in an ideal case sense, but in a practical sense. How much and how fast can you make it, and how fast do you really need to make it depending on your demand. If your demand increases, can you meet demand? And if your demand increases, do you have the materials and the personnel to get a little bit farther before you have to hire somebody new or move into a larger space, for example? So these are all, and this is not day to day, these are like month to month, and in some cases, several months to several months, assessing and reassessing to make sure that you understand what your process is and what has changed and what could change in the very near future. And that helps you plan a little bit for what comes next, because when you're a startup, it is a little bit day to day, right? You could sink at any moment. You don't want to, but you could sink at any moment. So if you can plan a little bit ahead, that helps you make it to the next day and make it to the next week and make it to the next month. So once you start understanding your processes, you can start building a little bit of a map around yourself. You know what you need now to make your product. You know what kind of time it takes. You have an idea of what personnel and where you need to be, what your raw materials are, what your product is, how you're going to ship it, all of these kinds of things. And so you can start building your little ecosystem around yourself so that you know who all the players are in your entire, I don't know what you'd want to call it, not really operations field, but your entire sphere of operations colleagues, all the people that you might have to work with in order to reach your goals in your operations department. So here's us again in the middle, and I know that our money has to go to raw materials, our employees, and our rent, which is where we rent our space at the university. We know that we could get revenue in from our customers, so we have revenue coming in. We have other cash flow. We have other connections between our distributors, between the companies from whom we buy materials and with whom we might have collaborations. There are possible collaborations here. There are possible competitions here as well. And then all the way out here, we have our customers and who is behind our customers. So who are our customers, like who's making the choice to buy our materials and who's actually doing the buying, who controls the money. And all of these players in this area of how we get product to our customers. And it all comes into play when we're planning our operations. So if you start building this out, then you can start seeing everything that you need to kind of sort of keep your eye on as you're moving along. So that is a general overview of how our operations work and how I try to keep track on our operations, small as they are right now. I also wanted to include a little bit of information about starting a business in the US. And there are a lot of registrations, licenses, and taxes, and you can't afford to ignore those. And they might fall under the business officer or the executive officer. But a lot of times they take action. And so they, at least for me, they oftentimes fall into the operations circle. And so we have to take care of our licenses, our registrations, and our taxes. We have to have a business license for the city. We have to be registered for taxes in the state and in the country. We have to be registered with our Department of Economic Security. We have a license, I think I mentioned that, a license in the city and in the county, I believe. We have to have our regulations posted where our employees can see them, all 4 of us, where we can, so they're just smack right there on the wall, just all together, but they have to be posted where they can be seen. If you're applying for funding, there are more registrations to keep in mind too. And this is for the US. So I realize that this may not be applicable, but I imagine in other places there are similar kinds of registrations that you have to dig into. And it's a good idea if this is your part of your company, if you're in the operations segment, to keep this in mind, because a lot of times when other partners or business partners are planning, sometimes more heads the better, right? If you have more people keeping an eye on what needs to be done, then you can be certain that it will get done. And so if you're planning to apply for government funding, as we have, you need to have a Dun & Bradstreet number, and you have to be registered with NIH, or if you're going for NSF, you have to have accounts with all of these government entities. You have to be registered with the Small Business Administration and a bunch of others, and you have to do that before you can even apply. So you need to have all this ready before you start applying for funding from the government. If you are looking for angel funding, this has been very difficult for us because we have a very technical product. It's extremely difficult to explain our product and how it works and how it can impact our customers and have a broader impact on society in general without getting really, really technical really fast. And if you have non-scientists, as oftentimes is the case, they can be lost quite quickly. And so that has been very tricky. But it's also something to keep in mind. If you have mentors, use them. Please use them. They can help you. It will be maybe a little painful. They'll tell you when you're barking up the wrong tree, and sometimes it doesn't feel very good. But if you can make your presentation better, make your pitch better, you will get farther. So it is absolutely worth it. And if there are people willing to give you a hand, definitely take them up on it. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention and again for this opportunity. And I'm happy to help out in any way I can. I know my experience is a bit limited here, but I'm very glad to be here, and I hope to get to talk to a little bit of all of you.
Thanks, Colin. I think it's time to take some questions from the students. You guys can unmute and you can ask questions. Or you can just write it in the chat box. Okay, we actually had one question from the student. So I think what he's asking is about the operational costs. So one thing you mentioned is you have to manage the operational cost. So how do you get around this operational cost? Can you just give some suggestions, and can you enlighten us a little bit about negotiations when you are working with some companies?
Okay, so it depends on where those operational costs, where they're going, at least in our case. We are right now funded by what they call friends and family. So we have those initial people who believe in us and have given us some money to try to keep us going. We also have some SBIR funding. And so it gets a little bit complicated there. So also wrapped into my operations is development, right? If we were a larger company, we would have a separate R&D arm doing their own thing. But right now that falls into my yellow circle. And so a lot of the money for the SBIR can help with the development. And then there is some amount that can help with some of the operations costs, depending on what those costs are, if that makes a little bit of sense. And so it gets very difficult very quickly. So you have to keep those operational costs as low as possible, but also within the bounds of the funding that you have. That makes sense. I don't know if that really answers your question. If you don't have money for certain operational costs, if it's something you can let go, you might have to temporarily let it go. And sometimes it's extremely painful and extremely difficult. But yeah, that is an ongoing challenge, is finding the money to cover those things. It's kind of like keeping the lights on, right? It's finding the money to keep the lights on is very hard.
Right. So it's always a tricky part when you have to manage the operational cost. You have to optimize. You have to know that what you need essentially and what you don't need non-essential things. So sometimes you have to shut down your non-essential things.
Absolutely.
So one thing is when you approach a company at that time, maybe you want to sell your product. So how do you negotiate? Any suggestions on that? Like,
So we haven't really gotten to a point yet where our companies are our customers. We are early, and our first target customers are actually other researchers, which makes it a little bit easier for us because we're researchers too, so we can talk directly to them. We find them through their papers, we find them through their university websites, we find them at conferences. Sometimes they find us. Sometimes we have been in contact with a couple of other companies. Sometimes that's through contacts. Sometimes, quite honestly, it's just through searching until somebody finally answers you back. And you irritate a lot of people doing that sometimes. But sometimes somebody will talk back, and then you can get started. Just say, we're interested, we're curious. Will you talk to us just a little bit? And then you can get further. And sometimes the answer is like, yeah, we don't do this. And that's okay. And sometimes they are curious, and then you just keep the conversation going. If that is, but we're not to a point where we've made a deal. So our sales right now are exclusively to individual researchers at this point.
So Abhishek in the chat box has another question. So what he's trying to ask is how do you screen for the team members? So if you have to select a team, so how do you select your team members? If you make a wrong choice, it's going to be a really big problem.
Yes, that is very true. So we've tried to do that very carefully. So we have two co-founders, right? And we've known each other. I almost don't want to count the number of years we've known each other. We've known each other for a long time. So we've worked together in some capacity or another for at least 15 years. So if we can't get along after 15 years, that's probably a pretty bad problem to start with. We found our CEO looking for a mentor, actually. So we were looking for a mentor originally. We interviewed several people in our community. So we kind of put out a call to our startup community, and there's usually very good interaction in our local startup community. Startups are always willing to help out other startups. And so they find some people with more experience, maybe they're retired and they're looking for another project, because they don't want to stop. They're still interested in life and in the world. And so they're looking for another project that's not really their career anymore because they're retired, but they still have all of that experience and that insight. And you talk to them, you make sure that on a personality to personality, you can get along. You don't have to be buddy. You don't have to agree on everything. And in most cases, it's probably good if you don't agree on everything. But you have to be able to work together, and you have to be able to work it out. So talk to them a couple of times, and that's how we found our CEO. We talked to him a couple of times. We talked to a bunch of other people, and then we talked to him again. And then we brought him on as a mentor, and he was a mentor for a while. And then he became so interested, he wanted to be our CEO. So we talked some more, and then we brought him on as a CEO. So it's for us, thankfully, at the beginning, it was started with people who've worked together in the past for a long time already. And then the people who have joined, we've been very careful to make sure that they are people who both fill a need that we have, but are people that we can work with as well.
Right. So there is another question in the chat box. So how to determine the success of the product?
Feedback. Glorious feedback. So I mentioned earlier, it's so important to be close to your customers, because when you have those first customers, they will give you feedback. And that is so very critical, but they need to be comfortable giving you feedback. And so we talk to our customers, we try to have a good, close, positive relationship with them. And so that if something does go wrong, they will tell us, and they will tell us what they think is wrong. And that is how we determine if our product is successful, is whether or not they are getting the data they want. And that you can only know by listening to your customers when they talk to you. So you have to establish a relationship with your customers where they will talk to you. You don't want them to get mad and go away. You want them to tell you when they're not happy or if they are happy. It takes time, but it's absolutely worth it.
Right. So I think that's all what we have for the time being. Maybe it's time to take a break. And once again, I would like to thank Dr. Colin to generously accept the invitation for giving a talk that I believe will motivate a number of students. It was an excellent talk where Dr. Colin enlightened us about the operations of the startup, need to proactively plan ahead. I would also like to thank Dr. Amjad Hussain, IISE team, IISER Bhopal, to organize and be a part of this wonderful event. I would also like to thank IISE Innovation Club and all the participants. Any event cannot needs participants, and the success of an event is dependent on the participants. So I would definitely like to thank all my participants. With this, I think it's time to take a break, and we will see you again in the series of future events. Thank you all. Thanks again.